Yasas. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greek's Greekness or your own ethnic background. September 14th, the day of remembrance of the genocide of the Greeks of Asia Minor. It was established by the Greek Parliament in 1998 and is observed every year by Greece and the diaspora. Greek Genocide Resource Center explains the Greek genocide refers to the systematic extermination of the native Greek subjects of the Ottoman Empire. The time frame of the genocide of Ottoman Greeks, Orumi, lasted from 1914 to 1923, 9 years. This does not include what were essentially pogroms that occurred throughout the entire 600 years of the Ottoman Empire. Last year in our episode on the Smyrna catastrophe, we invited Helen Vardakis, whose family lived through the terror of the Turkish assault on ethnic Greeks in the region. The massive scale of death and the incredible suffering of the Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians as they were driven out of their ancestral homes, tortured and murdered, has been well documented. But it's not very well known outside of these communities for political reasons. Before we get into this very heavy and disturbing topic, we want to mention September 14th is also an important feast day for the Orthodox Church, the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. We'll link a video. Ευλογημένη μέρα. Today's topic is an unexpected two-parter. We wanted to talk about Asa Jennings, may his memory be eternal, and the miraculous rescue of literally hundreds of thousands of refugees escaping genocide at the hands of the nationalist Turks. But understand how Jennings did what he did, the challenges he faced, and how the Greeks of Asia Minor were trapped in this situation to begin with. We need to provide some background and a trigger warning. Over 2 episodes, we'll be describing the heroic efforts of this humble, simple man and those who worked with him in the face of horrific violence and destruction. We're avoiding most of the more graphic and gruesome stories of the events of September 1922 because this is hard enough to talk about. But there will be disturbing descriptions in order to make known the first Holocaust of the 20th century, the Greek and Armenian Holocaust, which inspired Adolf Hitler later in his vicious persecution of Jewish people. Some historical background will help us explain events Asa Jennings witnessed in context. It's a simplistic overview of a very complicated series of events over many, many years. And as an aside, in the West, we've become used to so-called Christians oppressing other religions or whining about being persecuted themselves and being called out. But in the East, Christians are the minority and have faced real persecution over many years. Ionian Greek colonists first traveled to Asia Minor, or Anatolia, from what is now mainland Greece over 3,000 years ago, around 1000 BCE. They founded cities along the coast of Asia Minor, from the Mediterranean Sea along the Aegean to the Black Sea. They pushed further west and north to build farms and farming communities. A large swath of Asia Minor was part of the ancient Greek world. Homer, Herodotus, Diogenes, and many other giants of the Greek classical era were born there. Armenians and Assyrians have also been in the region since antiquity, along with the other non-Hellenic peoples that predated the Greeks, Hittites, Phrygians, and others. Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians became mostly Christian in the early hundreds organically, before the church became the church. The Turks were originally a group of nomadic tribes from the Altai Mountains of western Mongolia that moved towards Central Asia, mingled with other ethnic groups, and began entering Asia Minor in the 11th century CE, first as mercenaries for Arab leaders, and later founding the powerful Selçuklu Empire in what is now northeast Iran. They'd begun converting to Islam from a mix of different beliefs sometime in the 8th century. The religion became widespread throughout the Turkic tribes in the next century or so before being designated the official religion. The Turks founded the Ottoman Empire and began their conquest of Asia Minor in the 14th century, solidifying dominance in Eastern Europe a century later. This is all to establish that Greeks and Armenians had been in Asia Minor for well over 2,000 years before the Ottomans entered the region and took over. And they were still there for the next 600 years under the Ottoman Empire. Under Ottoman rule, Greeks were clearly second-class citizens, as were Armenians. They had to pay taxes, were at risk of execution if they showed disloyalty to the empire. But they weren't allowed to give evidence in court against a Turk. Greeks were regularly harassed, beaten, raped, robbed, killed by Turks, but had no recourse in the law. Lou Uranek, author of Smyrna, September 1922, called it the Jim Crow system of the Ottoman Empire, only the bigotry was based on religion instead of skin color. Christianity was kind of tolerated, but if the Greeks got uppity, their villages might be razed, their churches destroyed. Entire villages might be condemned to the slave block or slaughtered. It had long been common practice to seize young male Greek children, to be converted to Islam, then raised and trained in the elite Turkish fighting forces. Young girls and women were regularly kidnapped into harems of the leaders of local governments or raped with impunity by anybody coming along. So when today's Turkish nationalists try to tell us how great Greeks and Armenians had it under the empire, we're inclined to disagree. It's very similar to the way some Americans claim black people had it good under slavery. In the 19th century, a number of countries fought for their independence from the Ottomans and won, like Greece. But the Greeks of Asia Minor remained part of the Ottoman Empire. By the end of the 19th century, the empire was crumbling. Nationalist forces were working their way into the Ottoman Empire, believing that if the empire could be purged of unbelievers, as they called the Christians, it would be pure and rise again. A lot like the Nazis or the MAGAs of today. In their minds, their success depends on the suffering and expelling of others. Greek Genocide Resource Center provides the basic MO of nationalist forces regarding the Greek and Armenian population back then. Their motto was Turkey for Turks, like America for Americans. Their actions included massacres, forced relocations, death marches, summer expulsions, boycotts of Greek or Armenian businesses, rape, forced conversion to Islam, conscription into labor battalions, arbitrary executions, destructions of Christian, Orthodox, cultural, historical, and religious monuments. End quote. Their leader was Mustafa Kemal. The population of Greeks native to Asia Minor in the early 1900s was between 2 and 3 million. The First Balkan War in 1912 saw Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria fight their common oppressor, Ottoman Turkey. And Turkey lost. Greece seized Salonika, now Thessaloniki, and the Aegean Islands, all of which had majority Greek populations. This enraged the Turkish nationalists, who chafed against weakening Ottoman leadership. They began a campaign of wiping out Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian villages throughout Asia Minor. Uranek says, along the Aegean coast, homes were burned or torn down, men, women, and children were slain in the fields. End quote. If residents weren't killed outright, they were marched hundreds of miles to the west to what was called the interior of Asia Minor, where those who survived worked on the equivalent of chain gangs until they dropped dead of exhaustion, starvation, or dehydration. Their villages were burned to the ground to cleanse them for Turkish settlers to move in. Even the minority Turkish population would be forced out of a village, so it would burn and purify. The Ottoman government began a propaganda campaign against Christians, targeting schools and mosques with misinformation and lies about the Christians. Germany helped out and years later used the same MO to begin a dehumanization campaign against the Jews. The killing escalated when the First World War broke out. American Consul George Horton, who served throughout Greece and the Ottoman Empire between 1893 and 1924, reported to the State Department, quote, from 800,000 to 1 million human beings are going through this process of slow and hideous torture, and instead of waning, it is increasing in ferocity. They are driven along for weeks or months without food or shelter, brutalized, raped, and marched to their deaths. Consulates all over Asia Minor confirm these accusations. Protestant missionaries reported in July 1915 3,000 women and children were deported to the interior. After a march of 70 days, over nearly 1,000 miles, only 35 survivors reached Aleppo. Apparently, the logic was that the soldiers weren't actually murdering their victims. They were just dying. The Ottoman Empire had sided with the Germans during World War I from 1914 to 1918. Yeah, they were pals. When the United States entered the war in spring of 1917, war was declared against Germany, but not Turkey. Like Great Britain and France, America was keenly interested in the oil fields in the lands still under Turkish control in the Middle East. As the war ended, Britain, France, Italy, and the U.S. created the Treaty of Versailles that broke Germany and inspired Hitler to seek revenge years later. Also part of the treaty, Britain, France, and Russia set out divvying up areas of formerly Turkish land for themselves. As a reward for throwing their tiny army into the fray on the Allied side, Greece was given land that had once been Hellenic. With the promise, the Allies would defend Greek rights to the land against Turkish aggression. But here we go again. These three great powers were so interested in getting their share of whatever lands they could get their hands on post-war, and simultaneously trying to make nice with the new nationalist government that had succeeded the Ottomans, that they watched the small Greek army move into what had been Turkish territory for hundreds of years and forgot about it. In 1919, the Greek army pushed into the Anatolian countryside, under the assumption the British would support them as they set about restoring Greek villages, and took over the wealthy cosmopolitan town of Smyrna. Where some of the soldiers behaved badly toward Turkish residents, and some of them were punished, though no doubt fewer than should have been. Greek refugees from the countryside who'd escaped Turkish violence before and during the war returned to their homes. Naturalized American citizens originally from the region also returned, certain the Allies would keep Anatolia secure. And when Kemal and his nationalist army began to retaliate, the more advanced and civilized nations of Britain, France, and Italy turned their backs and shrugged their shoulders. And that spelled the end of the Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians in Asia Minor, and culminated in the death of millions, the displacement of millions more from their ancestral land of nearly 3,000 years. Oranek writes, the absence of Allied forces in Anatolia to support the Greek army or enforce the treaty led to a resurgence of Turkish brutality against Christian minorities. Executions and deportations of Greek and Armenian Christians resumed with new ferocity throughout Anatolia. He also quotes an American aid worker assigned to the region in 1920. Quote, Turkish authorities frankly state that it is their deliberate intention to exterminate the Greeks, and all their actions support this statement. Asa Jennings made his appearance in Smyrna in August of 1922, as the Kemalist forces were in the process of routing the Greek army in the countryside west of Smyrna and the coast. He'd long worked for the YMCA both in America and in Europe during the war, where he'd given exemplary service in aiding the decommissioning of soldiers, making sure they were fed and entertained while waiting for the long voyage home. He'd been rewarded with the assignment to Smyrna. Let's talk about Smyrna for a minute. It was a city of 500,000 people in 1922. Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Jews, and Turkish Levantines were the major ethnic groups, with a majority Greek population going back to its founding. Greek and French were the primary languages, with a smattering of Turkish blended in. It was a beautiful city called the Jewel of Asia Minor, considered one of the financial and cultural centers of Greece, and one of the wealthiest cities in the Ottoman Empire when it was still owned by the Ottoman Empire. Most of the businesses and financial institutions were Greek. The education system was dominated by Greeks. Levantines, not to be confused with the native peoples of the Levant, were the city's elite, the obscenely wealthy descendants of Europeans whose families had been living and trading in Smyrna since the 18th century. They were able to get out before everything went sideways. They weren't the target of the Turkish nationalists. Asa Jennings was born in upstate New York. He was humble, devout, poor. He dropped out of university because he couldn't pay tuition. He came from a long line of American Methodist ministers, and for a time became an itinerant minister where he was traveling miles around to act as pastor for small communities that had none. He was a very religious man. He started his career in the YMCA in Utica, New York, as an assistant secretary for boys' athletics. He was in his late 20s, already married and a father, when he contracted typhoid fever, followed by tuberculosis, permanently damaging his lungs and his health. He wasn't expected to live, but he did. And he told his wife he believed he survived because he was needed somewhere to do something. By the time he got to Smyrna, he was 44 years old, almost 5 feet tall, but stooped with a hunchback from the damage the TB had caused to his cervical discs. He had poor eyesight, and his illnesses left him with only 45% lung capacity. I have trouble breathing just thinking about it. He was said to be warm and kind and made friends easily, except for his new boss. Apparently, Mr. Ernest Otto Jacob, the director of the Smyrna Y, had hoped for an athletic young man as an assistant to set an example for the boys in their programs. Throughout, Jacob treated Jennings disrespectfully and dismissively, according to a number of witnesses, including Navy Captain Halsey Powell, who will appear later in Jennings' story of heroism. According to Uranek, Jennings' assignment in Smyrna would be to engage boys of different faiths and ethnicities, Greeks, Turks, Armenians, and Jews, in sports and healthy outdoor activities to teach tolerance, responsibility, and Christian virtue. He was delighted to be in Smyrna, the city that was home to one of the 7 churches established during the early days of Christianity, the region containing so much of early Christian history, mentioned in the book of Revelation. Jennings had brought his wife, daughter, and 2 sons with him. They were housed in the American neighborhood called Paradise, right next to the International College. They were charmed by the vibrant cosmopolitan city that boasted every cultural attraction imaginable: theaters, museums, opera, music, dance. The architecture was impressive and much of it historical, but every modern amenity was available. The gardens and the seafront, spectacular. Orchards of oranges, figs, and olives surrounded the city in outlying areas. It was truly paradise. By September 1st, 2 weeks after their arrival, the Jennings family began to see ragged groups of people trudging along the road into the city, refugees from the countryside. The Greek army in Anatolia was retreating, and the ethnic Greeks and Armenians escaped with them. Jennings had been told in August when he arrived that any war in the offing wasn't coming anytime soon. But over the next 2 days, the number of refugees was multiplying. Temperatures were in the 90s, 30 Celsius. The people were dirty, their clothes ragged. There were so many children, pregnant women, old people. It was obvious they'd come a very long way and carried very little with them. They'd had to leave quickly. On September 3rd, Asa went into the city proper to visit the American consulate, concerned about what he was seeing. The lobby was packed with Greeks and Armenians who were naturalized American citizens, frantically trying to get the papers they needed to get out. The American consul to Smyrna, George Horton, was frantically trying to process them. British, French, and Italian warships began entering the harbor, which momentarily convinced that shaken population they had come to protect the city from Turkish attack. That had been their pledge when the city and surrounding countryside was turned over to Greek control. But The French, Italians, and Brits had broken off pieces of the Ottoman Empire, creating new countries out of the area now called the Middle East, giving themselves access to crude oil. They had no interest in antagonizing the belligerent nationalist Turks and getting into another war to keep them in line. Their citizens wouldn't like it. It would have created problems in the volatile regions where they'd stake their claims, lowering profits. Italians were even providing arms to the Turks. The Allied ships had only come into the harbor to collect their own nationals before all hell broke loose. The Greek governor of Smyrna, Aristides Theriades, already knew the Greek soldiers that guarded the cities would soon be retreating along with the rest of the army. Greek and Armenian citizens began stockpiling weapons to defend the city and their families. This would work against them when the Turkish army later overwhelmed the city. The Greeks and Armenians would be considered Turkish citizens again, and their actions treasonous. Horton had been warning Washington of the imminent disaster and was trying to get an American naval ship stationed in Smyrna's harbor as a show of force to the advancing Turks. Unfortunately for him, the man the State Department had put in charge of such things, working out of the U.S. Embassy in Constantinople, was Rear Admiral Mark Bristol, titled U.S. High Commissioner to the Ottoman Empire. Bristol had a sort of ambassador-type position. There were no official diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Turkey at this time, so he was there to smooth things over. He aggressively downplayed any aggressions by the Turks because of his very pronounced hatred for Greeks. He'd stated that Greeks, quote, were worse than Jews and Armenians. So he was a charmer. It's been suggested Bristol's hatred for Greeks came from his belief that Greek immigrants were stealing jobs from Americans during an economic downturn during his youth. And I hope all of the Greek Americans I know and the diaspora everywhere remember this the next time people make nasty remarks about immigrants. Kane kalitera. That was us once. Bristol had good relations with the nationalist Turks, maybe because of their shared hatred of Greeks, maybe because they were all bullies. When Horton sent an urgent cable to Bristol on September 2nd, begging for Navy vessels to protect against a nationalist army attack, and for Bristol to mediate between the Turks and Greeks to save Smyrna, the admiral wasn't interested. Oh, and Bristol was the de facto racist in charge of American humanitarian aid in the region, and chairman of the Red Cross in Constantinople. You can guess how that went. As the Greek army in the Anatolian countryside retreated, its leadership seemed to evaporate, and some of the frightened, frustrated soldiers damaged villages they and the ethnic Greeks were leaving behind, playing tit-for-tat with innocent Turkish citizens. They weren't doing their countrymen any favors. The soldiers who'd kept their heads gathered groups of ethnic Greeks to send on trains into Smyrna ahead of the advancing Turks. Meanwhile, Horton had called a meeting of Americans at the consulate. Jennings' boss, Jacob, and other higher-ups of the YMCA had been on vacation since the previous week, which goes to show how quickly everything had changed. Asa attended the meeting to represent the Y. There were American businessmen, administrators from the International College, missionaries, and other important American nationals present. During the meeting, Jennings asked Horton if the Americans could create a plan for aiding the refugees coming into the city. Most were starving and exhausted from an unimaginable trip over hundreds of miles. Later, Jennings met privately with a few other Americans and urged Professor Lawrence from the International College to bring up the aid plan they'd been working on at a follow-up meeting at the consulate on September 5th. Jennings had already started collecting subscriptions for it, meaning donations from the wealthier Americans in the city. At the September 5th meeting, Professor Lawrence was named chair of the Smyrna Relief Committee and given responsibility for the local orphanage. Missionaries had been grabbing up orphans throughout Anatolia as they escaped with the refugees ahead of the Turkish army. In some sources, the American Relief Committee is used interchangeably with the Smyrna Relief Committee. We're sticking with the latter for the most part because that's what the American founders called it. But later, Jennings sometimes used American Relief Committee for clout. The Americans, like the British and French, knew their flags and citizenship protected them. The Turkish government wasn't looking to pick a fight with the Allies. They would keep their hands off of any building, conveyance, or person sporting an American flag or people invoking their citizenship, at least in the beginning. On September 5th, Jennings was made chair of the Kitchen and Feeding Committee, in charge of feeding the displaced people who were already numbering close to 250,000 as more and more streamed in. Kemal had timed his attacks in the countryside to coincide with the harvest. Refugees escaped, leaving food behind to feed the attacking army. Jennings immediately began scouring the city, looking for flour and ovens that the committee could use. As he passed the quay, he could see the moneyed class lining up at ticket offices to escape on steamers. Smyrna was loaded with bakeries. Jennings covered the entire city with a car he'd borrowed from the Y, or more often on foot, hobbling along with his bad limp. He covered miles in the heat, struggling with cardiac asthma and a low-grade fever. He suffered constant pain and shortness of breath, but he never stopped. He contracted with bakeries of all sizes to take flour the relief committee would provide and bake bread for the refugees to be delivered to feeding stations the relief committee had set up throughout the city. Meanwhile, Washington was besieged by American citizens concerned about the stories pouring out of Asia Minor as American reporters stationed there cranked out the news. Washington was pressured by the public to order Bristol to send a destroyer to arrive Wednesday, September 6th. Contacting your government representative does make a difference. They're afraid of losing votes. Mediation, however, was a no-go. Food supplies were already becoming scarce as Jennings struggled to travel through increasingly crowded streets to appropriate what he could. It was estimated over 30,000 refugees were coming into the city daily, and those numbers kept increasing. Asa knew the Greek army was preparing to evacuate. They had the greatest store of food in the city. The commander had already refused requests for supplies from the relief committee, but he'd never come across Asa Jennings, who was described as having such a kindly, peaceful, friendly way about him he was disarming. And iron-willed. The commander finally gave in, offering the 1 million pounds of flour in the army warehouse. But the timing couldn't have been worse. As the army was distracted with preparations for departure, looting had started to break out. When the army finally left a few days later, the Turkish army swept in and seized the warehouse. But now, before the Turks arrived, Otto Jacob, Asa's boss, returned from vacation to a city in chaos. He relieved Jennings of his responsibilities, even though everyone agreed he'd been a great success in his duties for the relief committee. Even though the idea for the relief committee had been his, he was relegated to errand boy. But Jennings was a humble guy, and he had faith, believing all that matters was that he helped the suffering however he could. He'd been shunted out and left to his own devices, so he made himself busy. He'd befriended a wealthy Greek doctor when he'd first arrived, and now that doctor came to say goodbye. He was leaving Smyrna and his large mansion at the end of the quay behind. He offered it to Jennings, who quickly conferred with Horton and accepted. Immediately, Jennings reorganized it into a safe house and first aid station for pregnant and injured women pouring into the city. The hospitals were already overflowing, with the many refugees injured or taken ill during their escape. The U.S. destroyer Litchfield had arrived early on the morning of the 6th, as promised. Armed U.S. soldiers went ashore the next day to protect American nationals. On September 7th, there was an announcement that a new general would relieve the commander of the Greek army, and they would defend the city after all. Martial law was declared. The Smyrna Relief Committee was handed another orphanage to run and took over a large commercial warehouse an escaping businessman had left in the care of a committee member. They'd keep track of what they used and reimburse him later. The committee opened a water pipe that ran above ground so the thousands of homeless could have clean water. The Greek army reinforcements arrived. But seeing the city packed with refugees and the soldiers they were replacing who had escaped with the refugees in such terrible condition, many refused to go ashore. What? Their forces weren't enough to stop the Turkish army in any case. The people of Smyrna very quickly understood the Greek army would not be defending the city. The governor scrambled to charter ships to evacuate the Ottoman Greeks, knowing they would be considered traitors living in a Greek-controlled city. He was not successful. On September 8th, the Greek soldiers were loaded onto ships for evacuation, and a small number of refugees accompanied them. The Turkish army was 24 miles away, or 38.5 kilometers. Greek officials quickly left as well. Governor Styliades was the last member of Smyrna's Greek government to leave. Turkish citizens celebrated on the quay. Jennings' boss was still ignoring him, so he took on the task of searching the city for injured or pregnant women to lead to his shelter. There are many accounts of the strange, tiny, hunched American limping up and down the city streets. As he brought more women into his safe house, which was quickly filling up, Asa kept an eye out for other abandoned mansions he could use. The Turkish National Army entered Smyrna from the northeast on September 9th, 1922, and made its way to the harbor. Soldiers brandished weapons and demanded money from Greeks on the street while their commander ignored them. The last of the Greek soldiers evacuating were captured or killed. The murders began that same day. Turkish soldiers and civilians breaking down the doors of homes and businesses in the Armenian quarter, dragging out the residents and killing them. Greek and Armenian Ottomans were collected and executed for treason. They were shot or hung, their bodies mutilated. The officers encouraged Turkish residents to come forward with any complaints about their Greek and Armenian neighbors, to name names so they could be arrested and punished for the insult to a Turkish citizen of the empire. The accounts of horrified Turkish citizens later confirmed what was happening. One said, quote, "Desperate Greek men, they took them in a column, their hands tied behind them, and then shot them in the mountains every evening." Soldiers began to attack, maim, rape, and kill the civilian Greek and Armenian population without reprimand from their superiors. Uranek writes, "It was as if the nationalist generals in the old Ottoman tradition of warfare were giving poorly paid soldiers and camp followers 3 days to sack a conquered city." While American, British, and French sailors and officers watched, unable to intervene because of strict orders from their respective governments. The Patriarch of Constantinople appealed to the British government and the American relief organizations for help, to no avail. Greeks caught on the street were shot or beheaded, while Armenian women were led away to the soldiers' quarters. Uranek recounts an instance of Turkish soldiers firing on a group of Greek women and children, killing 48. A British officer described that scene, in which a boy of about 3 played around the body of his dead mother, still holding a baby who was still alive. A Turkish soldier stepped up, shot both children, and continued on his way. The same officer reported seeing one of the Turkish officers grab a teenage girl away from her mother and younger sister, stripping and raping her before shooting her dead. And on and on. Meanwhile, the relief committee began hiding as many Greeks and Armenians as they could from the soldiers and civilian mobs. Allied nationals closed themselves up in their homes with Greek and Armenian servants and the servants' families. Those homes and hiding places were saved by the American, British, or French flags that they flew. No one touched Asa's safe houses either, because he'd put up American flags all over those buildings. The Turks began shutting down the water supply. Meanwhile, Bristol refused all calls for help from the consulate and from his own officers distressed at the situation. He had written, "The Greek is about the worst race in the Near East." When the British High Commissioner at Constantinople, Sir Horace Rumbold, sent an urgent communication asking Bristol to use the American Relief Administration to help in Smyrna. His response was irritation, anger, and refusal. Bristol was despised by the British for good reason. He ignored pleas sent by respected members of the American community in Smyrna. He used his position of power to keep aid to Smyrna at a virtual standstill and resented any relief organizations that tried to help. Some of the refugees now crowding the quay were allowed onto barges, where British sailors were feeding the desperate people. Turkish soldiers pushed their way onto the barge and seized men between the ages of 18 and 45. As they took the men away, they told the British they weren't allowed to give the remaining refugees food or water. Because of their government's orders, the British sailors had to step back. Greeks and Armenians trying to swim out to Allied vessels were shot in the water. By now, tens of thousands of refugees were gathered along the quay and along the entire coast of Asia Minor, hoping to escape on Allied ships. The Morning Post of London reported 500,000 starving Christian refugees, Greek government without available money or ships. Or faithful allies, it would seem. Our last account for this episode is the fate of the Greek religious leader of Smyrna. This is all happening on the day the Turkish army entered the city, although a couple of sources say this incident happened the next day, September 10th, but most of them say it happened on the 9th. Nuruddin Pasha had ridden in at the head of his army as they entered Smyrna and installed himself in the governor's residence as military commander. Nuruddin was well known for his fanaticism and cruelty, even within the Turkish army. According to Greek Genocide Research Center, he'd already been implicated in massacres of Greeks. Nuruddin ignored the violence committed by his soldiers, and once he'd settled into his offices, sent for Smyrna's Greek Orthodox religious leader, Metropolitan Chrysostomos. A little background on the Metropolitan. Chrysostomos had been Metropolitan of Smyrna from 1910 to 1914 while it was still an Ottoman city. He returned triumphantly in 1919 when the Greek army took possession. He was an ardent Hellenist and wanted the parts of Asia Minor that had been returned to the Greeks consolidated into a new Christian nation, a separatist Greek state free from Ottoman interference. He had no problem clashing with the Greek governor of Smyrna or admonishing former Greek premier Venizelos for action he deemed unsuitable. Turkish nationalists were not fans. George Horton recorded in The Blight of Asia, the book he later wrote about the genocide, that Chrysostomos and the Armenian Orthodox religious leader had come to ask for American help in saving their people from the then advancing Turkish army. Horton knew him, quote, as a constant friend of Americans and American institutions. He'd visited and spoken to the American schools, the YMCA. He'd acted as go-between for the Americans in encouraging the government and the church to welcome them. Horton writes that before the Turkish army arrived, the Metropolitan, quote, was offered a refuge in the French consulate and an escort by French Marines, but he refused, saying that it was his duty to remain with his flock. A Turkish police officer escorted Chrysostomos to the governor's residence, where Nuruddin stood on the balcony above. An angry crowd of Turkish Smyrniots had gathered. Chrysostomos was famous for championing the nationalist Greek cause and actively supported the Asia Minor Defense League. This would have been reason enough to despise the Metropolitan, but Chrysostomos had been born in Asia Minor, making him a Turkish national according to the empire. He was condemned as a traitor to the empire, but wasn't given a trial or chance to defend himself, because he was Greek. Nuruddin called down to the mob to deal with the Metropolitan however they liked. I'm warning listeners here, what comes next is a description of extremely graphic violence, and we're only going there because Chrysostomos was such an important figure in the world of the Asia Minor Greeks, in the Greek world at large. He was a religious leader, an advocate for his people. And his death and the way it was carried out was an act of terrorism. He was chosen for that death because of what he symbolized to a persecuted people. In order to torture a persecuted people who dared to challenge the authority of those doing the persecuting. The mob grabbed the Metropolitan, beating him, and dragged him into a nearby barber shop. As a Greek clergyman, Chrysostomos had a long beard that flowed over his traditional black cassock. The mob forced him into a white barber's smock and tore his beard out. He was punched and stabbed repeatedly. All of this was witnessed by a squad of French soldiers under strict orders not to intervene. They told their superiors that the mob gouged out Chrysostomos' eyes, cut off his nose and ears. Still alive, he was tied behind a truck and dragged through the streets of the city. So the Greeks could see what they'd done to their revered religious leader. Monstrous. When told of the Metropolitan's horrendous end, French Admiral Dumenil commented, "He got what was coming to him." Man's inhumanity to man on full display, the arrogance. I took a quick look, but I didn't have time to find what the Admiral had against the Metropolitan. But nothing could excuse this cold-hearted remark. Chrysostomos was no doubt a challenge, a passionate man who pushed for what he believed in, obviously ruffling feathers wherever he went. Horton was appalled by what Dumenil had said. What he saw, and later described, was the controversial man who never shied from speaking his own mind, a passionate, devout man who loved his people. And he saw the bravery of a man who refused to take the safe road, while his people were in mortal danger. While those with the money or the right flags to protect themselves abandoned the city to its fate. In The Blight of Asia, Horton says he believed the Greeks should set him down in their history as a hero and a martyr. And that is exactly what happened. In 1992, Chrysostomos was declared a martyr and saint of the Orthodox Church. Sarantos Kyriakos was quoted by Telemacho Odysseidi in a Medium article about Chrysostomos. Kyriakos said, "The Turks killed the man and made him into an idea, and ideas never die and are never conquered." We're going to stop here. Take a breath. On our next episode, the situation will get increasingly dire for the Greek and Armenian citizens of Smyrna, and for the thousands of refugees who thought they'd find safety in the city. The shocking level of death and destruction, while Allied ships bobbed silently in the bay, watching. And that's when we see the mild-mannered, fiercely empathetic Asa Jennings take matters into his own hands and set in motion the biggest humanitarian rescue operation of the 20th century. And I just want to point out that in the teachings of Christianity and of Islam, violence, persecution, hatred, and revenge are all rejected. Religion isn't bad in and of itself. Only the people who twist it to fuel their own agendas or guarantee their power over others. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Deotis Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time. Yes, us.